That said, our recording has started, as many of you can hear. And Mary, you can go ahead and advance that slide. Unfortunately, you are all now entering the most modern form of sexual violence against women by being part of this panel today. And when I say that it is the most modern form, I mean it is the most modern form, given the usage of technology and the methods of distribution in which it is put out into the world. So we are going to enter this. We are going to have a very fruitful discussion about it, and we are going to come up with solutions and hear from our panelists the solutions that they have been part of. You can go ahead and advance, Mary. Thank you. So we want to focus on this because most victims of non-consensual intimate imagery, which is a blanket term for what has also been called, you see down here on the right side, revenge porn. This is a phrase that we try not to use. But non-consensual intimate imagery is the distribution of intimate images, whether they are real images or deepfake generated images, of a person on the internet with the intent to harm their reputation and well-being and status in the community. Unfortunately, most victims of this practice are women, approximately 90%, if not more. I think there was a recent study that just came out where it's now around 99% are women. Women are 28 times more likely than men to have their intimate images shared without their consent. And according to the UK Safer Internet Center's revenge porn helpline, again, we try to avoid this term, but some organizations are still using it. They recorded nearly 19,000 reports last year, marking a staggering 100% increase from the previous year. So the incidents of this are massively on the rise. And the women who are being targeted are either women entering the public sphere of influence or ending intimate partnerships or competing for professional positions. These are some of the most common reasons why, or political positions. And these are some of the most common reasons why this practice is occurring. We can advance to the next slide. Thank you. So a more recent study, 2023, I just saw the news that we actually have one from 2024 now, that 98% of deepfake videos online are pornographic, with 99% of those targeting women. Look at the imbalance of this. 99% versus 1% targeting women. That is very significant. And I mean, we're not even talking about 50% or 60% or 70%. We're talking about almost all of them targeting women. So this is a very serious issue. And the UN has taken steps, governments have taken steps, civics groups have taken steps to combat this issue as our daughters, our relatives, our wives, our girlfriends, our sisters are being targeted with this practice. You can advance. You are about to hear from three women who have been very immersed in this, who have experienced this themselves, and who have fought back with technology and legislation. And you will hear through their stories that there is severe emotional distress and mental health issues that victims experience. Post-traumatic stress disorder is common, anxiety, depression, as well as reputational harm and social isolation, but not these women because they have fought back. Some women, however, can't, or they don't have the means or the tools to do so. And that is why we are here again. We are empowering them to be able to and tell them what resources are available to them if they do find themselves in this situation. And I cannot reiterate this enough. This is ubiquitous. It can happen to anyone of any age. We can advance. Thanks, Mary. Our Wizard of Oz behind the curtain there. So we want to make sure that as this becomes more prevalently discussed, that you are aware of the terms and their impact. IBSA is another term that's widely used, image-based sexual abuse. There's IBSV, image-based sexual violence. NCII is a term that I use frequently, and that's the non-consensual intimate imagery. And the reason that these terms are preferred, Susanna, one of our panelists, her organization, My Own, has put together a media guide that talks about why we use these specific terms. is because this type of abuse can take forms in many different forms. And so if we're using the term deep fake, for example, it's only targeting a falsely generated image versus the percentage of people who have real images used. So we use NCII or IBSA or IBSV as an umbrella term for this action. And we try to avoid the term revenge porn because it generally makes the victim appear to have contributed to the wrongdoing in some way. It's kind of like a form of victim blaming or has been seen that way. So we try to avoid that term, even though some organizations still use that term in their names and their literature. So now that you've been informed of the terms, we can advance, Mary. Thanks. The good news is there is a lot of action being taken from the UN level to the global level, to the local level, to the civics level to combat this. And Resolution 79 is to intensify efforts to prevent and eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls in digital environments. 10 years ago, digital environments was not so much a focus at the UN because the focus was getting people across the globe access to the internet. But now that that access has become more ubiquitous, not entirely, but much better than what it was 10 or 15 years ago, and we see a rise in these types of crimes, the UN has taken notice. Every member state has taken notice and are now, at least a lot of them, not all, are taking active steps to criminalize this practice so that the victims can have some kind of recourse and these images can be removed, or we would hope they can be, but it's not always that easy. We can advance. Thanks, Mary. Which brings me today to our expert panel. And I am very, very happy to share the stage with these three women. They are incredibly inspiring. They have been through some of the worst possible experiences with this type of abuse that anyone can imagine. And here they are on this panel fighting back. They have dedicated much of their lives to fighting back against this, and they have made huge headway with it on both continents in Europe and North America. So first, I want to introduce Breeze Liu. Breeze is a globally recognized activist and entrepreneur shaping the global response to online abuse. She's the founder and CEO of Electo AI, a groundbreaking company building AI-powered infrastructure to combat this type of online image abuse. Through her nonprofit, the Electo Foundation, she also leads survivor-centered policy reform and international coalition building. As a survivor of deepfake abuse herself, and may I add, at the height of her venture capital career, Breeze transformed personal trauma into structural change, spearheading the historic Take It Down Act, which you are about to hear extensively about, the first U.S. federal law to criminalize non-consensual intimate imagery and deepfake exploitation. Welcome, Breeze. We are very excited to have you. Breeze has been invited by two U.S. presidents, Congress, the U.S. Department of Justice, and the United Nations to speak on technology-facilitated gender-based violence. She is also a key global advisor on AI regulation and digital safety and is widely recognized as a pioneering voice demanding accountability from some of the world's most powerful platforms, which is a huge part of the issue as to why these images remain online. Breeze's work has been featured in the New York Times, People magazine, Wired, and on national television across continents. Next, we have Susanna Gibson. Susanna is a nurse practitioner and mother, and what I like to call the salt of the earth of our communities, because she is a healthcare practitioner who very much cares about women. She's the founder of My Own Image, a nonprofit organization dedicated to changing laws and supporting survivors of image-based sexual abuse. After experiencing IBSA during her 2023 campaign for Virginia's House of Delegates, Susanna became a leading advocate for survivor rights and policy reform. She has helped pass or improve NDII legislation in multiple states and continues to fight for comprehensive protections for all survivors, having been one herself. Thank you, Susanna, for joining us today. And finally, Dr. Sylvia, and I hope I'm getting your name right, Semenzin, because I too have a family name that's a bit difficult to pronounce. But Dr. Sylvia Semenzin is a sociologist and international advocate specializing in online misogyny, technology, facilitated gender-based violence, and platform governance, which is really something we need. And from the European perspective, this is very helpful. Her work bridges academic research and feminist activism, combating digital ethnography, policy analysis, and survivor-led strategies to expose the structural dynamics of abuse in online environments. In 2019, she promoted the Italian campaign, and you're going to have to pronounce this hashtag for me, Sylvia.
Intimità violata.
There you are. Beautifully said. You probably said it better than I could have, which contributed to the criminalization and non-consensual intimate image sharing. Today, she advises European institutions, governments, and civil society organizations on the governance challenges posed by emerging forms of digital violence and the growing radicalization of anti-feminism online. Welcome, all three of you. I'm thrilled to share the stage with you again, and I know that our audience is eager to hear from your perspective. So I want to get started with a question for all of our panelists. And Breeze, we can start with you. So I want to get a brief recall of your stories from your own perspective, especially since we have new audience members on this panel. Can you share with us the moment you realized that an intimate image of you had been taken or shared without your consent, and what your difficulties were in the corrective actions with law enforcement and tech companies?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Jessica, for the great introduction. And thank you for everyone who joined us today. So I'll take you back to the moment when I found out about this abuse that happened to me. It was April 2020. It was a regular, beautiful Sunday afternoon, and I was sitting at home, and all of a sudden, I received a Facebook message from my college friend. And he said, I don't want to upset you, but there's a video of you circulating on Pornhub. At first, I thought it was either a joke or a mistake. My brain was refusing to believe that reality. And then he said, I'm very serious about this. I have to send you the link. You need to look at this. He sent me the link, and on the thumbnail, that was my face. And when I saw that, I think my entire world was collapsed because I didn't know how to deal with that. And I went to the rooftop of my building and I was trying to commit suicide because I was really overwhelmed with the shame and it just didn't know how to handle this situation.
Thank you, Breeze. And what were the challenges that you had in the corrective actions with law enforcement and contacting Pornhub to get this footage removed?
It was it was quite a journey. So I mean, obviously, I did call the police and try to. I at that time naively I believed that it would be a very simple and straightforward process. But when I went to the police, despite the fact that I am a UC Berkeley educated venture capitalist who has a very good job in the tech industry, I was slut shamed by law enforcement. So instead of helping me to in my situation and to help me track down the perpetrator, the police asked me, "Have you ever engaged in prostitution? Do you ever exchange money for videos or pictures of yourself?" Like and I had no idea how to deal with that kind of slut shaming. So I clearly there is a lot of things wrong with this, and then the image doesn't just remain on Pornhub. It proliferated all over the internet when the perpetrator realized that I was trying to seek justice. And also when he realized that there was nothing that I could do against him because I was being called a prostitute. I mean, for law enforcement and a lot of people, he's just an innocent boy who made some innocent mistake. So I think that is it is very unfair. And that was the norm back then.
Thanks for sharing that, Breeze. Susanna, I know you also had, in the height of your political campaign, had this experience, and it was physically mailed to everyone in your district, is my understanding.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. Uh, so years prior, I had been the victim of NCII, or the non-consensual intimate images, and NDII. I just didn't know it. And a lot of these images, where they live, are on kind of these pirate sites, parts of the internet that I was not familiar with at the time. So I had no idea. And towards the end of my campaign for probably the most competitive seat in the House of Delegates in Virginia in 2023, about 2 months prior, a political operative had found these images and circulated them to various media organizations, attached with a lot of lies and a lot of like gendered disinformation and misinformation. And unfortunately, what happened, and we see this a lot, people don't understand how the internet works, and they don't understand how these, recordings and images can be created and altered through technology. Unfortunately, the Washington Post decided that it was too good of a story to pass up, and they wrote about it. And what came from that was just this global explosion. One of my donors was in Belgium and found out about it there. Like, it was a global explosion of, like Bree said, slut shaming, but also just misinformation, very much gendered, and the widespread proliferation of these videos. I think one former candidate for Congress, and I think one of the Midwest states, had tweeted a picture of me, retweeted, and it had 6.2 million views. So when we're talking widespread, as Bree said, these images just kind of explode like fire. It's like dropping a lit match in a very dry forest. The images just spread across the internet rapidly and without any control.
Thanks for sharing that, Susanna. Sylvia.
Yes, hi everyone. I also want to thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So in my case, the situation was slightly different in the sense that I tend to consider myself sometimes lucky in terms of the extent of which my images were shared. In the case that we have just listened, those images went public. In my case, what happened is that I discovered back in 2017 that I had an ex-partner who had a chat group with some friends, I would say like 10, 11 friends, which was called Women Are All Sluts. And they were disseminating images of their girlfriends and friends, or women they were sleeping with. And so images in that group were both created with the consent of the women involved in the relationship, but also they were created without the consent, sometimes using hidden cameras, taking pictures when women were not realizing they were leaving the computers on while doing sex. So they had like different strategies to get the material. So the fortunate part was that the network remained private, but they were really having a network that was really organized to get this material. And so I found out, and for me, it was always not just a problem regarding, an individual problem. It was always collective, because there were at least other 30 women in that chat. And that's also what later brought me to investigate, Telegram cases or bigger environments of the internet where exactly the same type of chats, for male chats, are reproduced, but with bigger numbers. So where the numbers can arrive to 60, 70, 100 million, thousand. So yes, the fortunate part was that I never ended up, out in the internet. I discovered it before the images were published. So I think this is also an important part of the story, because it also tells us about how many ordinary women are also, victims of this kind of phenomenon, and how many of these women don't know sometimes, or are just, in a hidden space compared to the data we have and what we know about the phenomenon.
Exactly. Yes. I was going to bring that up as well, is that many people could have images of themselves out there and not even know it. And that's where Breeze's technology comes in, which we're going to get to, and a lot of the legislation we've been working on. So you've told us where you've come from. Walk us from the pivot from survivor to advocate. What was the moment where you decided, I'm not just fighting my case, but I'm going to change the law. I'm going to create technology that combats this. I'll start with Breeze.
Yeah, of course. So I actually wanted to share the story of my great grandmother because she was the reason why I didn't commit suicide, and she was the reason that inspired me to start advocating for this. So so when I was on that rooftop about to take my own life, to kill myself, I think my entire life flashed before me. And in that moment of despair, it was my great grandmother's story that gave me the strength to carry on. My great grandmother was born in 1908 during the last years of the Qing dynasty in China, and her life was shaped by the norms and customs of a society that systemically devalued women. She never learned how to read or write. She never left her hometown, and like many women of her time, was expected to live in silence. But she was the most resilient and incredible human being I've ever known. As a child, she endured the brutal practice of foot binding. It's a custom designed to physically and socially restrict women. The process was excruciating, and the consequences were lifelong disabilities. And it wasn't just about physical pain, it was about controlling women's bodies and reducing their mobility and freedom. My great grandmother also survived from smallpox, which left her face permanently disfigured. In a society where a woman's value were largely determined by her appearance, this meant she could only marry into a poor family. And she lived through the wars, the collapse of the empire, and the change of regimes, all while raising three children alone after her husband, my great grandfather, starved to death in a famine. And this woman, she endured unimaginable hardship and she never gave up. And she always held on to hope even in the darkest times. She passed away in 1999. It was just before the dawn of a new millennium. And because of her strength and perseverance, 117 years after she was born, I am here uh, before all of you in front of a computer, educated, free, using technology, and able to tell my story. But as an activist, like I realize, as much as the world had changed in the last century, some things just remain all too familiar. Foot binding was a relic of the past, but now the new tools of oppression have emerged. It was the online abuse, harassment, and NCII. It's the digital foot binding of our era. It was designed to control, silence, and humiliate women. So through all of my journey, I realized that there needs to be change, and also I have hope because I mean smallpox. This is a disease that's been with us with our civilization for thousands of years. We ended that a couple of decades ago. Foot binding has been in China for over almost 1,000 years. We ended that. So if we can end these things, this wrongdoing that lasted for thousands of years, I do believe we have hope, and we can and we will end NCII. So that's why I became an activist, and that's what inspired me to do this work.
That's so powerful, Breeze. I mean, we forget the power of our ancestors, right? What they've lived through and how we can take those lessons into this life, even. I know I've done the same in the past as well. Susanna,
You know, after my election, you know, the last 2 months of my election and my campaign were just kind of head down, like, I'm going to win now. You can't do this to women and we drop out or, go away. Like, the most important thing I could do was to win. So I was kind of very laser focused on that. But then post-election, oh, by the way, I won 48.8% of my district, which was a 49, which you would have expected a Democrat to win 49% of that district. So, but after the election, I had women from all over the world, most of which were from the US, reaching out to me. And they were sharing their own stories with me, but also they were asking for guidance and for help. And I had no idea how to help myself. I felt very underprepared for that responsibility, but really wanted to help. I'm a helper. I'm a nurse practitioner. That's what we do. And so it was through my work trying to help these women get any kind of justice or recourse or understand their options in their states that I began researching state laws. And I realized that the US just has this patchwork of laws, many of which are preventing women from getting any kind of recourse or justice. Some of the state laws, you have to be a former or current sexual partner. And if you're not, that doesn't count, right? As the non-consensual distribution of intimate images. And so it was really just through trying to help women who had seen my story and were just trying to navigate their own situation. The victim blaming and shaming is a very, very powerful tool. And a lot of women didn't feel like they could tell anyone. They couldn't tell their families. They couldn't tell their friends because they were afraid of what would happen if they did. And so victims are really left to kind of navigate the system and figure it out on their own a lot of the time.
Susanna, when I've referred to your story to people, I say Susanna is such a representation of your average person in the community, a nurse practitioner, making women healthy, and then decides to stand up and say, I'm going to run for office because I care about my community. And this is how you're repaid, essentially. So I think you represent a lot of people across, not even just in the US, but across the world who want to make a difference. And when they do step forward, they're met with these kind of consequences, which we have to fight, obviously. Thank you for sharing that. Sylvia.
Well, if you ask me when I decided to engage politically, I could not answer to that question because in my case, I think there was never a linear path that brought me to do activism. I think that was mostly gradual. So the moment, something that I remind and that I recall very neatedly with a lot of clearness is the moment in which I discovered those chats and the feelings of anger that I had first, before shame, before humiliation. I had like this feeling of being angry, and I remember discussing this with people from almost the very beginning and say, do you think this is normal? And people telling me, yes, men do that, so you must protect yourself. And so I remember that I started to think, like, I don't want to live in a society that normalizes this as something that men just do and we as women have to accept it. So for me, it was also very clear that we needed a cultural and societal change, in that sense. And so this is why I started to do what I could do, which was doing research and try to get data and definitions on the problem and get to know more about TFGBV, to understand how many women were impacted. And the more I was studying, the more I was realizing there was a pattern, there was a systemic problem. And it was impacting so many women, and so many of us could, be victim of that. So it was pretty natural for me, possibly because of my temperature, to try to bring out of academia what I was studying. So I started to engage with, civic organization, other activists. And I would say that what really saved me and in the end gave me the strength to push forward was meeting feminists, other feminists, other women who were believing me, who were validating my story, telling me that, of course, that was not normal. And so that brought me during a very long and complex political path, in which at the end we got the law done in Italy. But again, that also made me discover that as a feminist, and a young feminist, that's not a very, again, linear, and you can also encounter many complexities, many people who wants to harm you. So again, it was a victory, but it was also very complex, and in the end, it's about challenging the patriarchal culture and understanding that if that was easy, we would have done it already, so it seems that we still have a lot of work to do.
Yes, very much. And that which we've talked about your personal stories now and your journey into combating this. But now we're going to move into discussing regional policy and how we've worked on the technology and policy front in order to combat this. And Sylvia, I do want to start with you for our Europe-based audience, mainly because, and the reason I'm starting with Sylvia as well, who's on the other side of the Atlantic from where some of us are, is Europe has historically been better in terms of regulation and quickly regulating these harms. The US has been much slower and more resistant, and I would say it's a bit more of an uphill battle in the US to get some of these things through. So, Sylvia, we now there's many EU level rules and national reforms that have criminalized the non-consensual sharing of intimate images and deepfake abuse to varying degrees. I know from having lived in Germany, Germany has its own statutes, France has its own, but then you have EU-wide policy as well. So it's kind of an amalgamy. Can you describe some of these reforms for our audience so that they're aware? And also from your vantage point, what really feels like genuine progress and what still feels a bit like a patchwork of regulation?
Yes, of course. So I think that in Europe, we have, a tradition of digital rights or privacy movements, which has done quite a lot of progress in terms of trying to regulate violence and trying to regulate technology, which sometimes might sound as a bad word, but it's actually thinking about how creating better technology, putting ethical boundaries to a technology that today it's still very controlled by few and certainly not constructed with the idea of, giving voices to women or marginalized communities. So these are some conversations that were on the table. But I would start by saying that for some reason in Europe, we still have, all the technological conversation, which is mainly led without women or without feminists at the table. And then we have, feminist regulations, which are also advancing in terms of understanding technology facilitated gender-based violence. So starting with the feminist regulation, we have a very important European directive, which is going to be applied in the next 1 year and a half, I think 2 years maximum, which is the European Directive on violence against women, which collects 4 forms of cyber violence, which are cyber harassment, cyber stalking, hate speech, and also NCII, including deepfakes and alterated images. So that means that in the next 2 years, all European countries will have to adapt to this directive, and all countries will have to have their own law. Depending on the country, the way in which it's written might change, but they still have to criminalize this violences. So this is good news. But on the other hand, we know that once we mention violence and we criminalize it, it's not enough many times to actually fight it or limiting it, because this has a lot to do also with how digital platforms are built and constructed. So here is when we enter also in other 2 regulations that are really important to understand where we are now in Europe, which are the Digital Service Act, the so-called DSA, which regulates digital platforms, and it asks for more transparency, reports, and algorithmic transparency regarding digital platforms, with the obligation for the very large platforms, so-called those that are up to 45 million users per month, to fight the so-called systemic risk, in which gender-based violence is also mentioned as a systemic risk. But definition is very broad, and this the enforcement of the DSA, it's still work in progress, and it just deals with the big platforms. But this is something, so this is very important because it might oblige platforms to reduce the level of harm against women. And then finally, there is the AI Act, which is also looking at artificial intelligence, generative AI, and how it can also impact women. Sorry, not women, people, because this is not a gender sensitive act, so that's where the feminist presence or women presence is lacking, because it was never really understanding, AI, generative AI, as also gender problem, which is, as we see with deep fakes and stuff, it's quite part of the issue. So if I had to mention some of the limitation that we're seeing, I would say that, first of all, the fact that these two paths seems always parallel and never crossing, and instead I think we should contaminate more the digital with, feminist and survivors-led approaches. So as in the case of Breeze, like having more women in technology and producing, and also having a say regarding how technology is regulated with a feminist approach. And then on the other hand, I think also the fact that these regulations are not convincingly disrupting, the business model of how platform today are built and how they monetize oftentimes on women's body and women's violence. So we would need to have more courage in that sense, to really change the bigger issue. But that's very long, and of course, techno violence travels quicker than that regulation. So that's where we are now, and I think it's a good step forward. But again, a lot of stuff that we still have to do.
You're absolutely right. It travels lightning fast and is nearly impossible to contain once it is out there. And that's why we need these regulations, like forcing platforms to remove this type of content, which in the US has been a nightmare in the past. Going back we're coming from Europe to the United States, where I, as a journalist, had released the first piece on virtual reality sexual harassment 10 years ago. And back then, to paint a picture of how difficult this was, back then, if a person had a non-consensual image online, they essentially had to sue the perpetrator for copyright violation to get it removed because of something called Section 230 of the Communications Act in the US, or I forget the exact legislation on that. But Section 230 basically tells platforms that they have immunity, for lack of a better term, where they're not necessarily required to remove images or third-party content as quickly, and that has made it very challenging for women to get that taken down. But we've come a long way since then, and now I'm going to have Breeze and Susanna speak about how far we've come with that, because they have been part of the federal level Take It Down Act, which is a bipartisan act, and also Susanna at the state level too. So let's start with the federal experience. So, Breeze and Susanna, this question is for both of you. How have your experiences directly shaped the provisions in the Take It Down Act, especially the 48-hour takedown requirement and the coverage of AI-generated imagery in that? So, Susanna, we can start with you.
Yeah, we gave some input into Take It Down. I think, Take It Down is a wonderful symbolic gesture by the federal government, acknowledging that this is a serious crime that creates very deep and widespread harm for victims. And it does some good things. So one of the things that Take It Down Act does is it has a 48-hour takedown requirement. So once platforms get notified that an image is non-consensual, they have to remove it within 48 hours. But the take it down is not necessarily the kind of magic or golden bullet that we think it is. It goes into effect in May of 2026. So we'll see. But, only covered platforms are required to do this. So we're talking like Reddit, Facebook, all the meta stuff. Those are who are required to remove it, or else they face FTC sanctions. However, most of these non-consensual intimate images don't live on those sites. A lot of them live on these pirate sites that are hosted overseas, and with the US has very limited jurisdiction over being able to get any of them to force those type of pirate sites to remove images. So uh, we'll see about how the 48-hour requirement actually goes. The other thing is that federal prosecutors, I think I mentioned this in March, but federal prosecutors are overworked and under-resourced. And finding a federal prosecutor willing to prosecute these crimes, they're just not going to do it. And it's still going to fall to the states. So take it down doesn't preempt state laws. So meaning the state laws are still in place. What happens with take it down is it expands victims' opportunities and abilities to get any kind of recourse or justice, especially when you're facing jurisdictional issues and cross state lines. So it's still going to fall to the states and the Commonwealth's attorneys in the states to prosecute. So we'll see how Take It Down is actually used and what it actually does. I'm hopeful and again appreciate the symbolic gesture, but am doubtful that it's really going to be the magic bullet that we're all hoping it'll be.
Thank you for that input. And it is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. I just wanted to make sure everyone's aware of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that which has made it very challenging for people to get images removed from platforms like Meta or Facebook and a lot of the social media sites. So going to Breeze on Take It Down, Breeze, you were in the room and in many of the photos with the signing of it. Can you tell us what your experience was?
Yeah, so I mean, I think Susanna is very spot on that, this is only the first step. We still have a lot of work to do. So let's not pat on our shoulders yet because, we still don't know how this is going to, really help or not help these people, but at least now we have a federal law. It's an essential first step. So, I mean, I think Susanna already did a wonderful job to summarize, the limitations and, what ne more needed to be done on the legislation level. And she's the expert in that. So, I mean, I will just not be adding more on that. So I will be sharing more from a technology perspective. So, I mean, I do have a very interesting background now to think about it because my first job in the tech industry was actually on the trust and safety team at big tech company, which is the ones that exactly the ones we're trying to regulate, right? And my own personal journey of like takedown actually go all the way to Microsoft server that, there were 142 URLs on their server that they refused to remove even after I've met the president of the United States twice. So, and their excuse was like, we don't have the technology to do that. Think about it. Microsoft said they don't have the technology to remove these URLs, which clearly was a lie. And also I was a venture capitalist before I founded my own company. So I mean I know the reason why these platforms are being difficult because now you look back to the history of technology development, not just digital world. So I mean sexual content and pornographic content actually it always drives technology development. It's kind of weird to say, but it is true. So it was the Super 8 camera. At one point, it was like shooting porns, Polaroid photos, and Marilyn Monroe on these Playboys, and now even image search and the video streaming platforms. All of that was initially driven by sexual content. Even the Snapchat, social media, everything it attached to that point. So when we have male dominated patriarchy society that you mainly have let's put it more dicks in the room, then you naturally would have this problem. So I mean, so aside from legislation, we also need to think from a technology perspective, what drives the growth, and then you have to find a way to work with these companies because and more importantly, we need to insert more women into powerful decision making, places so that we can, shift, these dynamic and and then eventually create this positive change that we really needed.
And Breeze, you've done that with Electo AI. Do you want to tell us about how you're fighting this with technology now?
Yeah, so I mean, the idea of Electo AI actually came out of frustration because I mean, as someone who understands technology, who have worked in the industry, and I mean, I was very shocked initially to find out like, a lot of these nonprofit organizations and people who are supposed to be doing this work to address the takedowns aren't using technology. And I mean, I wouldn't name names because it doesn't look good on any of us. But some of some of the biggest organizations in this country, in the U.S., actually, they're still using tools like Photoshop or like manual things to do takedowns. And when you're dealing with millions of people being abused, like probably every day. I mean, it's not efficient, it's not sustainable, and it's not scalable. So if you want to deal with a technology-driven issue, you need to have a technology-enabled solution, and that's why I founded Electo AI. So what we're doing is very simple. We're trying to make the job easier for everyone because let's face it, me as a victim, I don't want to look at my own abuse. It's like looking at the cadaver part of myself who have been killed permanently, and I have to do it over and over again and go back to the crime scene. I don't want to do that. And for the content policy people at Meta, at all of this, it's really, really emotionally draining for them. I mean, Meta actually got sued, class action lawsuit by their own employees because they had to view these abusive content for hours and they were committing suicides. So, I mean, we're just trying to minimize human suffering, and if something needs to be replaced by AI, this is it. Review classifying the abusive materials and process them for takedown. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're creating a global hub to, process all of this and make it we offer immediate removal. And that is in our vision for, all the survivors. So they don't have to wait for years for their content to come down. And by the time it did come down, it's very unfortunate because a lot of these victims have already committed suicide and their content remains on the internet, which is absolutely outrageous. So we're just, trying to do our best to do it in a timely manner that doesn't involve any human suffering.
That's brilliant. Fighting the technology issue with the technology itself. And yes, AI can be a very powerful weapon in this circumstance. Interestingly enough, against itself when you think about it. Thank you,
Yeah.
Breeze. Thank you for
It's
that
like the
update.
nuclear deterrence, when both
Yes,
side of the conflict zone have nuclear weapons, then nobody wanted to push the button because we don't want to have a nuclear winter and we all die, right? So that's what it is. So if the other side have nuclear weapons, I'm going to equip all the women and children with nuclear, I mean not exactly nuclear weapons, but with AI, so we are safer that way.
brilliant. Thank you so much for that update. And before we get into Q&A, we wanted to save some time for audience Q&A. Susanna, if you could give us an update on the US states, because we did talk about at the federal level with Take It Down, which was a bipartisan legislation, many steps ahead of where we've been with this issue in the past, but we don't want to leave the states out from this update. Can you offer us an update on that?
Yeah, as of 2025, all 50 states now have laws criminalizing and addressing the non-consensual distribution of intimate images. South Carolina was the last state in the country without any law. And organizations have been going to them for several years. Legislation had been introduced, I think, 5 years in a row, and just never moved and went anywhere. It wasn't a priority for them. I was able to leverage my some of my connections that I made running for office and met the assistant or deputy attorney general of the state who really took it upon himself to shepherd our bill through. So myself and two criminal justice reform policy experts had created a model policy for states on the non-consensual distribution of intimate images because understanding where most of these cases were going to be able to be prosecuted and people were going to be held accountable in the states. We understood kind of the importance of that. But now this is before Take It Down, when we did this, and the SHIELD Act had been introduced and wasn't moving, wasn't going anywhere. SHIELD Act is very similar to Take It Down, but doesn't have the takedown requirement. Essentially, there are some other differences as well, but and it wasn't moving. It was sitting held up in Cory Booker's office because, and rightfully so, concerned about how new felonies were going to be used against marginalized communities who are over policed and how that might be used against them. And so that was the concern. And that's the concern with creating any new felony generally, is how is this going to be used and weaponized against marginalized communities? And so kind of understanding where the holdup was, I had approached one of the criminal justice reform experts that I knew and said, who had known a little bit of my story. I think we went out to dinner after the election. I just cried the whole time, like, you don't know what really happened. And he was particularly sympathetic. And so we sat down and we created something that we think is really strong and takes both the victim and people who do harm, takes everyone's perspective into account. And we've built something that we think is really strong and great. And we've worked in several states. And I would like to say that South Carolina went from having nothing to having the best law in the country because they basically have our model policy as their state law. But that was a huge win for victims. One thing I want to point out, though, and say, especially when we're talking about policy, is policy changes and laws can only do but so much. And one of the reasons, and this plays into policy and how it's difficult to pass, especially state policy, is when I think one of the things we're doing that's really wrong is there's this conceptual gap. So everyone does it, society does it, the public does it. We frame image-based abuse as a privacy violation. And when you frame it as a privacy violation, that one just completely downplays the harm. But two, you have to prove intent when you're talking about the law, which is why a lot of these state laws, almost all of them, Indiana does not, or Illinois does not, but most do. You have to have and prove the intent to harm, and not just the intent to harm, but some of them, Pennsylvania's is humiliate, harass, or intimidate, or something asinine like that. And it leaves out all of the reasons that someone might commit these crimes. And it's created a huge barrier for victims getting justice. So the intent component is a huge barrier when we're talking about addressing and prosecuting these crimes. But that is because we continue to speak about it and think about it as a privacy violation instead of what it is, which is sexual abuse. Privacy violations are, access and distribution of data, really, right? Sexual abuse is the non-consensual touching, exploitation, or behavior that takes away from bodily autonomy. The harm that comes with image-based abuse is not that someone saw my body necessarily. My partner sees my body every day. My kids see my body every day. Seeing or viewing a body itself inherently isn't harmful, but what is harmful is the violation of bodily autonomy and choice. And that is what makes it sexual abuse. When we're talking about sexual assault, we're talking about rape, you don't have to prove intent. Like the intent was already in the harm of the rape. Same with image-based abuse. And so I think one of the barriers we face throughout, because that also encourages victim blaming and shaming, which is what we see. You should have protected yourself better, right? Like you allowed this privacy violation to happen, shame on you, but it's not that at all. So, yeah.
You brought up an excellent point on the privacy issue versus it being considered actual abuse. And I think that's a great lead into opening the floor for our audience to ask questions. I know there must be some questions out there. So, Mary and Al